Hello, Lightworkers, and welcome to Megan's Mystical Mashup, a conversation between me and a guest about life, the universe, and anything in between. I'm your host, Megan Rounds, spiritual connector, healer, energist, and founder of Mystical Mashup. Welcome to today's show. Today's guest has been a member of the Lightworkers Lab for over 2 years, spending much of her time in the lab Lightroom and here in the main lab, where she hosts the weekly program Love, Glow, and Light Flow every Monday afternoon at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Her main modalities are energy alchemy, which she describes as reader, seer, healer, and holer. She works primarily with angels and whoever or whatever shows up for those she reads. She's also a medium with strength in all of her clairs. She's a longtime meditator and trained meditation teacher. She's also a yogi and shamanic journey work practitioner. Her main day job is massage therapy, but she also sometimes teaches yoga, dance, and facilitates meditations. When she's not wintering in Florida like she is right now, her main residence is in Narnia, also known as Crested Butte, Colorado. She was once a burlesque starlet in New York City, is almost fluent in French, and once dated a movie star, although mum's the word on who that might be. Please give a warm Lightworkers welcome to Christine Marguerite. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you, Megan. That was accurate and fabulous. Thank you for the introduction.
Oh my goodness, yes. I love reading introductions like that. See if I can take the guest by surprise with some of what I read, but it's all stuff you gave to me. So
it is. That is true.
I get to be a mirror.
Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today and having this conversation. I've been excited to get to know you a little better and hear about your spiritual journey. So let's start with that big, audacious question of what has been your spiritual journey? And if you can pepper in how you made your way to the Lightworkers Lab, that'd be helpful too.
All right. That sounds good. So where shall we begin? I'll do a couple of words about each decade. And then, because, I'm in my 50s, as we discussed a little while ago. And then whatever intrigues you more, maybe we can go more into that. Does that sound like a good structure for that?
Sure.
So I grew up in the Northeast in New England. And for those of you who have grown up in that area, there's old things happening. And we lived in an old house. And so, as you might imagine, being quite sensitive, not just to my family's vibes and energies in an empathic way, there was a lot of ghost activity. And more than half of it I saw and nobody else did. So I was one of those. That was tiny. And it started to mellow out like it often does, and you're weaned and trained out of that stuff for the most part. Although, until I was way decades later, it was still difficult for me to fall asleep at night because that tends to be when spirits will contact those who are sensitive to that kind of stuff. Energy work wise, I became really aware of that in my teens and would have different experiences with that. The first couple of few kind of shocked me that I could feel energy running through my body. So that was my teens. Started a little bit. Go ahead. Were you going to quest about something?
Nope. Keep going.
So that was my teens. I was in New York City for my 20s in college, and that was the heyday of the New Age movement. And I partook a lot. I was a dancer as well. A lot of my dance teachers were also meditation teachers. And so meditation became more and more. And I ought to mention my mom was a yogi. And so I was introduced to that kind of vibe pretty early on. Although she is quite psychic, she backs away from that aspect of her practice, as many yogis do. And she introduced me to tarot cards, things like that. And astrology. So I knew about the woo from pretty early on, I have to say. 20s was crazy pants, a lot of meditating, worked with a couple of different energy healers and crystal people, sound healers, everything that was available at the beginning in the 80s, 90s of the New Age thrust into the mainstream. It was happening before, but that's when it got kind of cool. So that was that. By the time I was in my 30s, heavily into yoga, had a lot of physical injuries, more into yoga, the physical practices, which led me even deeper into my meditation practices. Energy work was still available to me, but it was very much on the DL. I was very hush-hush about that. My body healed through yoga, meditation got deep. The freaky experiences started happening with Dark Night of the Soul, which had been happening since my teens. And as most people know, it reoccurs if you don't resolve it in the first go around. So I've had about 3 or 4 go arounds, and I have
say,
resolved.
if you did it in the first go around, I'd be so impressed.
Oh, I would too. Like, who is this girl? That is not what happened. So, yeah, and it was also Saturn return, late 20s, early 30s, and the yoga and the meditation and the movement, things like that. So I had a couple of rough years in my 30s, not sure of what I was perceiving. I knew I wasn't crazy. And I did talk to yogis and meditation instructors about what was going on, and that was helpful. By the end of my 30s into my 40s, it was very forget this stuff. I'd already dipped into Buddhism, but it was the Buddhism that looked like yoga, the Tibetan Buddhism, with the deities and the rituals and the gorgeousness and things like that. So I turned my back on all of that and got into nightlife. And as you mentioned, the burlesque scene and a different kind of dance and things like that. Then that left me a little empty of soul. And so I scraped myself and crawled myself out of that hole and got back to meditation. This time, it was very much in the Buddhist Theravadan tradition, which is mostly a philosophy, not so much a religion. And still very much turning my back on the early experiences as just sensations that arise in your awareness. So that was my 40s, getting out of my crazy depression and coming back to that kind of strict meditation practice within the Buddhist tradition. It did, however, help me between their insight, which we call mindfulness in common parlance, and metta, which is the heart practices, really helped me get back on track out of depression through the dark night of the soul. And that was the context I used. Even though that is a Christian mysticism term, it was very much used as a spiritual emergence kind of way to understand what was happening. So then by the end of my 40s, I was wondering what I was doing with my life, ended up becoming a massage therapist, working on people's bodies, particularly those who have an experience of trauma, either capital T or small t trauma, and we're using body work as a way to come to terms with their present moment as a lived experience. And in some of those sessions, that's when, as people know me now, Christine, that's when and that was probably about 4 years ago, this working with trauma people began my new launch deeper into the woo, which I had rejected for about a decade. And that was working with trauma people and me needing to auditorily hold space for them while I was touching their bodies so that they would feel safe. And in doing that, it helped them receive touch, particularly the way I was using my voice. And doing that, I was speaking about whatever I saw. And that's when the intuition kicked in again. And that snowballed into other things. I ended up back in therapy because I had no idea what was happening. The therapist I was working with was also a Buddhist practitioner, recommended I look at deity practice. Yes, it was very
That
ooh.
sounds fascinating.
It was juicy, and it very much tapped into my meditation practices of yore within the yoga and Tibetan Buddhism. And so I started looking at different things and different ways to embody these qualities of deities, or just really archetypes. And what did I need to embody to cope with my own trauma stories that were emerging? That led me into really wanting to stay in a Western context instead of an Eastern context in terms of understanding archetypes. I landed on angels. I was raised Roman Catholic, so that was familiar to me. And that exploration through YouTube is what led me to Crystal. And she has a ton, as everybody knows, almost everybody who's watching this, she has a ton of stuff on YouTube and a lot on angels. And I started to make these connections. And then I just really wicked digged her vibe. I just liked how she spoke and how gritty and earthy she was and regular and not like the woo that I remember way back when. It was now. And then that evolved to, I don't know, 5 or 6 intensives in the Lightroom, in the lab. Here I am talking to you now. So that's the Reader's Digest of 50 plus years.
I really, I love how condensed I mean, I would love to learn how to do that. What you just did in 10 minutes, all of the key points from decades of your life. And that's so fascinating. You've had just this amazing kind of a spirally life so far from what it sounds like. And I'm fascinated by it. There are so many things I'd like to ask you, but I'm really right now kind of honing in on the deity and angel piece. I do want to plug, I think it may be a paid program, but it's in the Lightworkers Lab website.
It is.
It's all about angels. And I have not taken that myself, but I am surrounded by people who have, and everybody is like, it's so amazing. So highly encourage you to check it out.
It's amazing.
Yeah, see?
Even if you don't want to practice, even if you're not a practicing or wanting to be a practitioner of light work, like as a professional, very worth taking it. Yeah. It's deep and you shift.
As is what happens with pretty much any program you take that Crystal is a part of. And
agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed.
But so the deity piece and that shift, I don't know if it's a shift from or an inclusion of, the Eastern and then the Western into the angel aspect of that. Can you talk a little more about that? Maybe how your thought process went with that, but what is it about, explain a little more about what the deity practice is and how that was incorporated into, or how have you incorporated that and angels into the work that you do today?
Wow. We could literally spend the rest of the show talking about that.
And if we do, that's okay.
All right. I love that you love that. So deity practice, it's in many different Eastern traditions. I don't know that we have that in Judaism or Christianity. Not that I'm aware of anyway. So generally speaking, it is being aware of a deity, which is essentially an archetype, in whatever way makes sense to you. Usually there's a visual. Sometimes there's a geometric symbol, sacred geometry symbol. There's different qualities, kind, joyous, whatever, that you might ascribe to a person. So you really begin to personify an energy. Colors, whatever lights up the archetype for you, whatever lights up the deity for you. And that is the first stage, identifying.
Is this something that happens during meditation then, or you just start to notice these shifts in energies around you at a particular time or in a certain
So that
situation?
would be that would be a decision and an intention that you know before going into meditation.
Okay.
You have chosen one, or if you're working with a teacher or guru, they will choose one for you. So that's the first stage. Go ahead.
I was just going to ask if that is also then, I mean, is that then somebody who is ultimately like a guide? So you continue to connect with that particular deity for certain
Ah,
purposes?
within traditional contexts, yes, slightly yes. It's more to develop a particular flavor of relationship where it that has a hierarchy to it, where they have more of something that you as a supplicant want. So it has that kind of deity, she serving the deity feel. But that's only stage one. The more important part are the later stages, and I won't take up time going through all of it, but generally you begin to embody it. So you can, using your imaginal realm, your imagination, feel, experience yourself in those colors and those clothes. If you want to dress like that in your daily life, yay, go ahead and do that, or wear a gem or a color associated. But eventually you become it.
Wow.
You
Okay.
become that mind, you become that heart space. One of the intentions in the Eastern traditions is that begins to point at no consistent sense of self. Once you become the deity, you are no longer supplicant or student. You are the knower. You are that archetype.
Okay. Wow.
So,
Wow.
so that is, I've really slaughtered what those practices are,
No,
but
but
that's the gist.
it's reminding me of a very westernized adaptation of that of personas. And so, like, if you notice, there's something that that you'd like to have as a strength that isn't currently a strength, that you can create almost like your own avatar and personality around it, and you call on that name or that persona and then allow that to embody you.
Become it.
So it's that's what we in the West do, right?
That's what we do, or that's what
Yes.
we do with that, or that's the
Yes.
context we
Yeah.
understand that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter the context, your phenomenological first person felt experience of it is what's important,
Yeah.
not the cultural context it arises in. So to shift to angels, I had particular deities that had meaning for me within my way back machine, way back when practices. I wanted to see, because I was very wanting to be in the now, be who I am now. Wanted, and I live in the United States in the 2000s. I am here now. And a lot of that means not just the Jungian archetypes that are, whatever we're doing with it in the realm of woo in terms of archetypes, but also Christian archetypes of angels drew on my tradition of yore. But they were also really, with the whole Doreen Virtue thing, becoming really popular in the West, or still, as this, what's a new way to envision these qualities? And I really wanted to update it. It was just sort of a hunch on my part to see where the overlaps were between particularly a couple of Hindu deities and a couple of angelic energies.
That's
Did that
beautiful.
answer your question?
Yeah, I wasn't sure. I mean, I didn't ask it with an end in mind. I was just curious
Okay.
about that evolution from more Eastern philosophy to Western angelic. And yes, so let's just say yes.
Great.
I, I keep thinking about the almost full circle or like a spiral. I always consider learning to be more like a spiral than a circle, because we're never at the same place, even if we circle around to something that we had visited before. We're different people at the time. And so I'm really fascinated by your revisiting Buddhism, but from a different approach. I'm not as familiar with the two different approaches that you had mentioned. And so would you be comfortable sharing a little bit about that? Just about the differences
About
between those two pieces of Buddhism. I don't know that I can actually read my notes because I don't look when I'm writing. um,
I
I,
can briefly, like how I experience the differences. Hold on. The current or the later practices of my 40s, and I still use some of those skills, are very much based on skills, and they're very bare bones. How do we experience the present moment? How, what is mindfulness, and what are the skills needed to be aware of the present moment? Sensory clarity, being aware of what you're actually perceiving through any sense gate, having equanimity or peacefulness with whatever arises, etc. So it's a little bit more focusing on everything that arises in your perception as not the ultimate. You keep dropping what's next, what's next, what's next. Or you keep including, you keep including and. It's two different approaches to the same end. With other types of Buddhism, they arose within particular traditions that use deities. And that's what I discovered early on with Vajrayana and Tibetan Buddhism. Lots of deities, dakinis is really what you would call them. Dakinis are like fairies, except a little bit bigger in stature and a little bit more fierceness.
Ooh,
I want to be kind and say fierceness. Okay. Ooh, they mean business. Even the gentler ones, they mean business. So it's very much involved with favor asking and a little bit of embodying different qualities. But one of the traditions I worked in, embodying a particular color along with the flavors of it. So that it's very, one has a more ritualistic, spiritualistic feel to it. The other one has a little bit more cut and dry, philosophical taste, if that makes sense, which doesn't mean it's less juicy. I mean, anytime you sit to meditate,
sure,
there you are. And yeah.
So did you incorporate meditation through all of the different phases of your life, or when you were in the, even when you were in your soul searching part? That's not what you referred to it as, but were you still meditating there? Was that a common thread, or was that another thing that you had decided not to do for a while?
During the prodigal daughter phase in my 30s?
Well, yeah. Well, the dark night of the soul, I think, is what you...
Oh, the dark night of the soul. Yeah. I would say the one that happened in my 30s was clear to my perception, was my third venture into the dark night. I had started with meditation and completely dropped it.
Okay.
Said, forget this. I don't buy it. I'm not doing it. I'm moving full on into the material world. So that was really the only time I ever stopped. That's not to say that there aren't ebbs and flows, and you spoke about it in terms of a spiral. So even though I've been meditating probably since, not earlier than my teens, but since my teens, it doesn't mean every day for 20 minutes.
Sure.
It ebbs and flows.
But it's been a part of your life for a good part of it, except for those times when you just were like, no. That's been my experience, where turning my back on things in the past. I don't even know if it, for me, it was as blatant as a turning my back. There were times when I just was not receiving. And a part of that not receiving was not listening to myself and any of I was listening to some inner guidance, but it was probably more egoic based than anything else. And so it was like, I may have done my own form of meditation when walking and things like that, but most of the time at a certain point in my life, right around the same time frame you had mentioned for you, I was very focused on external.
Mm.
And, some of those more materialistic things as well, like profession and title and money and things like that. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's helpful to go through those things. I now have a context and I know how much I want it to be a part of my
Yes.
life or don't. And at the time, I
Yes.
didn't.
And that's the gift of that for sure.
Yeah,
Now you know. Yeah.
exactly. Yep. So I'm gonna skip back to your childhood, and you had said your mom was a yogi,
Yeah.
right? But then I heard you say you were raised Roman Catholic.
Hmm.
And so how did that work?
For my mom, how did that work?
Well, for you, I mean, so were you exposed to a number of different, it seems, I mean, you had been introduced to a lot of the things that some people aren't introduced in their lives for quite some time, until their adult years. And I am always fascinated by that, in terms of you were raised with Roman Catholic, teachings, and yet you had a mother who embraced other alternative approaches to that, in my view, at a time when that wasn't necessarily widely receptive. I don't know if it's even widely accepted now. It's accepted, it's tolerated maybe, but it's like, so how did that work for you? And it may not be that your mom was the person going to church, but how did it work for you where you were being exposed to these different things and making sense of those, as a part of your sense of self and worldview?
Oh,
Just
that's
a
a
little
beautiful
question.
question. Who you are. How did that, um, when you're that, you don't know any differently. That was what the world was. It didn't there, so it wasn't an opportunity for doubt. There was nothing to doubt. It was just learning and understanding. For my seeing my mother with the yoga, that was Lilius Folan, on PBS. That was like the way, way back, right? I don't
Yeah.
know if I can say that name. I apologize if you're going to
No,
have to edit
that's
that out.
okay.
I don't know. All right.
No, she was on
Um,
TV. That's okay.
okay. For what I understand of her speak as talking about that, me observing her, it was a physical exercise. She didn't talk about her intuitive, back then she would call them psychic experiences, until decades later
Mm.
during that period of her life. So they were happening. I just didn't know about them.
Oh, okay. I thought it was more
I
overt
just
than that.
No, it was her doing stuff. It was her doing yoga. And I would do it with her as a 4 or 5 year old, like it,
That's super cool.
yeah, I guess. Yeah, it was just what it was. The church thing is interesting because eventually I was the one who wanted to go to church and nobody else did. When
Oh,
I was
okay.
a little kid, it was magic water and magic wafers and I, the Roman Catholic tradition is gorgeous with the flowers and stained glass, and there's singing, and you stand up and you sit down and you stand up and you sit down, and you don't really know what's happening, but it has this sort of mysticism in the symbols.
That is
And
such a beautiful way to describe that. I just have to tell you that really resonates with me because my experience wasn't the same, but I'd gone to a number of different types of churches, even though most of my family didn't. My grandmother did, so I would go to her with Catholic church. And I agree with all of the things that you'd mentioned, though, you just named why I was fascinated by it.
yeah, it's full of magic, right? And
Yeah, I just never
the
thought of it that way until
angels, and
now. So thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. And, the angels are cool. Mary's really fascinating. Jesus is really cute. And like it's meant for little girls in a way. It really informed me. And those sensibilities is
Sure.
what I would say more than anything. So those were, and I would say with the yoga, that it's just a physicality, way of being with the body in a mindful way that I didn't know that's what she was doing because you don't think about it until later. I had
Sure.
words to describe what those experiences were. So kind of like that.
One of the things, there's two ways I want to go with this. One is that it seems like the common thread that I've seen throughout all of the different phases that you'd mentioned is movement. And so to hear that you were doing yoga with your mom when you were young it comes as no surprise because it seems like that's something that's always been. I mean, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but my perception is that it's been an integral part of your life and that it has had to be like a priority for you. And so when you came back, I mean, burlesque is, body too, and then coming and doing massage work and all of that stuff. Was that intentional or was it just that the way things flowed for you?
It's what I'm drawn to when I'm interested in it, interested in. Yeah, it's always been body. Always a dancer. When you're a ballerina, you start really young.
Yeah.
And so I was always, yeah, it's always, but yes, you are correctly perceiving that.
Now, how do you feel about the spiritual aspects of, is there a spiritual connection to body through dance? And I mean, I'm not asking this question the way I'd really like, but it's like, I would,
Ask it the way you'd really like.
well, I'm not exactly sure what that is. It's not coming out yet.
Okay.
What spiritual connections, if any, do you feel there are between all of these different, the physical aspects, the movement, the body work, all of that stuff, and and light work?
That is a huge question.
I like to ask big questions.
You are good at this. I love them. So if we can just make this 3 hours long, we can really go deep.
We can always do a part two.
So there are so many different ways to talk about this. When I was in my 30s, I ended up in graduate school. And one reason was to cope with the experience I was having. I was living at an ashram, and that's intense. And it's body and body as the vehicle. That was what my thesis was on. How far can you go with your spiritual evolution, the evolution of consciousness with a body-based practice? So that's one way to answer your question about what that is and how to approach that. There are other ways too, in terms of what are we using the body these days and how do I use it, not just in terms of massage, but in terms of a map for consciousness, a map that I can see physically with my eyes or seeing the not so solid manifest as energy. So that's another way to talk about body as anchor. So it does very much anchor you through all, and at least two other different ways of approaching an answer to that question. But through all of it, the significant, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish your thought. I can hold it.
I love that you can do that. You're a Gemini. I love that. The anchor of the physical as something that lights up with divine energy or is surrendered and released into spiritual experience, always constantly anchoring your consciousness in it, as opposed to the escapist route of spirituality where you're avoiding and abandoning your body. My emphasis has always been on coming back in and coming back in and coming back in. And there's endless mining to be done with that.
That is,
Yeah.
I love that the way you put that, and it really struck a chord with me because I am that. Well, I shouldn't say I am. I have been that person who has been out of my body most of the time. I have more recently, and I'd say really only within the past couple of years, since I've been a part of the Lightworkers Lab, since I've been doing this show, learning slowly how to inhabit my body and in a conscious and mindful way. And I am
Yes.
challenged with that regularly. And so a part of me, feel free if you're comfortable answering. My question is how, if you were to talk to somebody like me who's like practically lived most of her life in outer space, what are suggestions that you would have for bringing it back home to the physical?
I think, how is outer space, by the way?
It's pretty awesome a lot of the time, but it's like
Sure.
sometimes hard to
I
relate
mean,
at a physical level as a result.
I don't damn it. Ideally, you want to have ability and access to both and all. And exactly my first impulse when you were speaking on your experience is slow is good. How you're doing it, slow is good. Too fast, these peak intense experiences are harder to integrate in a real way.
Sure.
And they can explode your circuitry or your nervous system, whatever way you want to talk about that. Slow is good. Slow, consistent. Not once a month. Daily or a couple of times a week of whatever practice you choose that has meaning for you. Don't do what I tell you, somebody else who seems to know a lot about it. Like, explore wide and find something that lights you up. And you're like, oh, I can do that. I can roll my shoulders for 20 minutes every day and breathe at the same time. Like, and if that's how you're experiencing your body, that's awesome.
Thank you. And
You're welcome.
I mean, that's really helpful. I think that going slow piece is interesting, and sometimes challenging because I will glom on to things that really resonate with me, in part, I think, because it feels good in a physical way and something that I'm not very used to. And so it's like, then I just want to soak it all up, and I allow that. I do see the cyclic nature of that, though. It's like I'll absorb it, and then I have to synthesize it. And when I'm doing that, I'm not always practicing in the same way that I could. That consistency is a challenge for me. That's maybe also a Gemini thing, but not only. I've got a Sagittarius moon, so it's like, I don't know. Consistency for me is, this show is my consistency, and that's about it. But it's, I just, the whole idea of body as a vehicle, body as an anchor, and how that shows up for you is really fascinating to me, in that for you, if I understood correctly, the spiritual aspect of life is really, achieved through the body. Is that a fair assessment, or did I kind of muck it up?
It's not the only thing, but that is definitely true. That's not untrue. And there are more
true and
to that.
Yep.
Yes and is how I would answer that. Can I want to offer one more thing, and perhaps
Sure.
You sharing your story with me is a way of speaking to people who have a similar resonance with what you're speaking of. And you're talking about the cycling in and out, which very much makes sense why you're talking about spirals, because that's your lived experience of how things work, particularly for yourself. It's really important, I believe, this is just my opinion, to not judge it.
Yeah.
To let that be its own perfection in its own way, and not needing it to be consistently. I mean, I just said, yeah, do it consistently every week, 5 times a week, every day. That's me. That's how I roll. If you roll differently and you see a pattern, I think you have to trust that.
I agree completely. I think that accepting what is, and allowing, like giving ourselves permission to be our unique selves, is incredibly important. And I think that is probably, from a conditioning standpoint, one of the hardest things I've been able personally, but also I know there's a lot of people out there who have this too. It's just very releasing that conditioning and the judgment and things that go along with not being that consistent, but that's, just one example, but being like everybody else, yet at the same point, we're encouraged to be our unique selves. I mean, it's like one of those weird paradoxes of our times, and
Yes.
probably many times in the past. But
Yes.
that allowance and granting permission to me is a huge factor in finding that peace within ourselves, and that includes physically.
I concur completely. It's probably step one before any practice ever.
Yeah, and then I would say that, except for me, where it is like step 72, because now I'm at this point where I can do it, but before it never occurred to me. It was always
Mm.
feeling bad about who I was in comparison, not in comparison in a very, I'm comparing myself to others, but why can't I be what I think other people have wanted me to be? Why can't I be a way that other people have wanted me to be? And that aspect was a huge learning throughout most of my life, only culminating now. And so if it can
Yes.
be step one, like for my daughter, I would love that.
Of
And she is getting a lot of that from me, where it's like, accept yourself
course
for
she
who you
is.
are, you be you. you know, Everybody
More
else will
than
fall
you
into place.
probably know. Yes. I'm glad you finally arrived there. That's
Me too.
beautiful to hear.
Well, and I hope it's a long rest stop in this space, instead of a temporary thing where I go spiraling again. It's like, I want to take this with me. This is in my baggage,
Ah,
my
maybe it'll
toolbox or whatever.
spiral again. And you're going to have to be okay with it spiraling and falling apart,
Ooh,
right?
yeah,
Like
another big lesson.
radically okay with every chaos, for sure.
Well, we still have about 9 minutes left. What would you like to talk about from here?
I want to talk about you some more.
No, this is about you.
um, whatever comes up, whatever comes up. For me, one way I would like to add when you had asked that question about these threads that you observed through my life, accurate, very true. It all, from a certain perspective, the whole perspective of zooming out and seeing from very big picture, it's all very much one thing. It's different iterations on the exact same expression of consciousness that you may call spirituality, that you may call whatever you want to call it, and physicality, whether it's dancing, massaging, doing energy work, making love, walking on the planet, breathing. It's all the same expression, just different clothes, different ideas of it. That's how I experience it.
I just love the way that you expressed that. The words that you used to describe it really resonate for me, and it's something I'd never really thought about before in that way, of this expressiveness and how we express it, but it's just in different ways. But the expression itself is consistent.
Pretty consistent. I believe that we all have these consistent threads.
Yeah.
We may just not honor them or value them in the way that is most helpful.
Is this something that you feel then? I mean, for me, I go back. There was like a saying, and it may still be out there somewhere, but that, when you're really trying to find your life's passion, go back to what you did when you were a child. And because that expressiveness, I think, was a lot, was more, was unleashed, maybe less contained than it is once we get to a certain point in our lives. And I have I'm using that word now. I have regularly gone back to my childhood and think about all the things that I enjoyed doing, and it makes perfect sense to me that I like variety in my life because I had so much of it as a kid. And
Great.
there was like, I was outside a lot of the time, and that's something that's not so much the case with me now. And probably one of the biggest differences. But I'm surrounded by nature. I get to go in my backyard and be in nature, and that's pretty awesome. And it was similar when I was a kid, but I was so much more active then, and I expressed it in a much more physical way than I had, especially once I moved into my 40s. And then into my 50s, I'm trying to make a change of that. But I guess my question is around your perspective of, is that a good practice going back to, I don't like that wording, but is that a full circle kind of thing to reconnect with our childhood and how we expressed ourselves then as a way to identify what may be beneficial to us now in adulthood or may be missing now that we're doing this circling back? Does that make sense? I don't feel like I
That does
articulated.
make sense. Are you asking? I would say not necessarily, but true for many.
Yeah.
And helpful. I would say if it brings up good feelings and it is helpful for your present moment, yeah, definitely helpful. That may not work for others.
Yeah. Well, more and more I'm recognizing, I've always thought about individual differences to more general approaches that, are put out there. I don't know if you've heard of human design. That's something I'm really interested in
Yes.
right now. And it really
Right.
helps to recognize the differences and especially subtle differences between all of us and why some of these larger things and approaches don't really work. My professional background has been in change and transition and things like that. And it's like, why does change fail? Well, because not everybody changes and adapts to change in the same way. And people need different things. And they respond differently, and some need more time to adapt than others, and some we all go through a different process. But,
I concur, yeah.
it's sometimes hard to convince, CEOs that we should take an individualized approach to a large systems change.
I mean, it's harder. I could understand that because they're dealing with a large populace. And, the bigger things are, it's harder to pay attention to the minutia. And there's so much minutia, even within us viewing ourselves. There's incredible amount of detail. I think my thinking around that is the best that you can do is to offer ways, skills, tools to be able to trust and discern what your own authenticity is. What is your truth in your way? That's a better skill building, I think, than telling somebody, this is how I made $1 million. You do it too. Here's my formula. Formulas can be helpful if you want to take them in and then tweak them so they really suit you.
Well, and one of the things that I learned early on in the Lightworkers Lab that I think applies to these different concepts and things where it's like, why can't I achieve what that person has achieved, is recognizing to take what works and release what doesn't, because some things may resonate and work, but you have to adapt them to your own approach, your own perspective, your own worldview, your own experiences, and trying to copy somebody else's is never going to, well, I shouldn't say never, but, is really hard to do. Well, and for me, it's never worked. I can never really, I am not successful when I adapt somebody else's thing, or when I adopt somebody else's thing and try to do it based on their formula. I have to create my own way.
Yes, you're maverick. I love that.
Very much that. Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I concur. I believe that. Right now, I believe that. I could change next year. I don't know, but yeah.
Well, we've already reached our hour. So I just want to thank you so much, Christine, for taking the time to talk, for sharing your story, your wisdom, your insights. I really, really appreciate it. And, let's do it again sometime. I think it'll be really fun.
I would love that, Megan. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here. And I really love hanging out with you and chatting with you.
Me too.
And so thanks for asking me. I really had a great time.
It's my pleasure. Well, I also want to thank our viewers. Thank you so much for being here. I hope
Thanks,
that this was an
everyone.
enjoyable conversation for you. Thank you all again for being here. I wish you a magical, mystical weekend and life beyond, but also just stay healthy and high vibe, okay? And we'll see you all next time.